I have a MC W.Rokkor 28mm f2.8 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling. This lens is very similar to the MC W.Rokkor NL lens here that I previously disassembled. I think they have a pretty similar optical setup, but on the design, you can see that this one has the later MCX style design, while this one has the earlier MC2 style design. But internally, they're pretty similar. There are some significant differences in the layout, but taking them apart, you can generally follow a pretty similar pattern in getting these two lenses apart. This is actually one of my favorite lenses to shoot with because on a ASPC camera, it works out to be about 30 millimeters, and this particular lens I found just produces some really nice images. There's nothing really I can point to say why it does that. It's not too sharp, but I just really like shooting with it. So what I'm going to be doing today is actually fully taking apart this lens, getting access to the back optics, taking off some of the body sections, getting access to the internal mechanical components, and just discussing how you would repair some problems with the lens here. So we'll start off here and actually going from the back of the lens, just get access to the back of the diaphragm here, because that's usually what would be wrong with this type of lens. You might have oil on the diaphragm. So looking at the back of the lens here, you'll notice that on the back section here on the back element, there are two little sets of divots. So there's one on this outer ring and then there's one on the inner ring. The inner ring is for a little circular black section that's going around the top here, and that's holding in the back glass element. The outer ring is the one you actually want if you want to remove the entire back glass group. So that's what I'm going to use in this case. So I'm just going to use a spanning wrench in the outer ring divots to remove the back optic here. Alright, so there's the little tiny back optic. For all these wide angle lenses, for the Minolta lenses, you always have the really tiny little back optic and then the front optic much larger. And if you look a little bit more closely at this back optic, as I was describing before, let me get this focused. There's that second set of divots on there, and that's holding in this black ring going around the top section there. You can actually remove that as well and undo that ring to start removing the individual elements if there's actually fungus inside of the glass here. Similarly, on the back section here, the second little set of divots right here that you can also undo to further undo the elements and actually clean inside the various optics. This is one of the most complicated lenses that Minolta made optically, at least in terms of the number of elements it has. I believe it has 11 separate elements or something in here, so it's a little bit more challenging. There's more places where the fungus could possibly be in the lens. So now we have access to the back of the diaphragm here. So that's good, but now let's get access to the front of the diaphragm as well. And it's a little bit more complicated on this lens just because of how it's laid out than on the NL version of this lens. But we'll go in from the front and get access to the front of the diaphragm here. So looking at the front here on the name ring, it's a flat name ring, and then going around there are two little divots, one here and one here, for a spanning wrench. So I'm just going to use a spanning wrench to loosen up the name ring and get that off. Alright, so there's the name ring going around there. And what's kind of different about this lens is that when you look at this next big glass piece down there, usually on these Minolta lenses they'll have some set of extra divots around here that you can use the spanning wrench on to just remove the entire front optic. And that's not the case here. You can see that there's nothing you can actually see on how to remove this front optic. So the only way I found how to do this is to apply pressure around the edges here, which can be difficult if you're not careful and if you have a new copy that's still stuck in place pretty hard. You have to apply pressure around the edges to just loosen up the front optic here. But once you loosen it up, you should be able to unscrew the entire front optic and remove that like that. So now we have the front optic, or at least part of it. There's actually another little piece right back there that we'll get to in a moment. So now we've removed the front optic here. And let's just take another quick look at this while we're going in here. So this front optic has a few different layers in it. Unlike the back optic, it doesn't have any divots for a spanning wrench on the front section here, but it does on the back section. If you actually want to clean inside here, you can take off this back little thing, the back little ring going around here to remove the backmost glass element. And then all the other glass elements, if you can see that there's fungus or something inside closer to the surface here on the front, you actually have to unscrew the various rings in here. So there's this front section right here, then there's this middle section, and then this back section. And all three of those unscrew separately. It can be pretty challenging to actually unscrew these, especially the first time, because they will have some little bit of adhesive going around right there. But you can actually clean very well inside the lens if you need to. So that's one nice feature about the lens. Even though it is more optically complex, you can clean inside it very well. So now we have this next layer. And in my case, this layer looks a little bit different because normally on these lenses, there's this kind of black foam stuff going around in this section down here. And in my case, because this lens it's I think 40 or 50 years old at this point, that black foam stuff was just falling apart, so I actually removed it all. I'm not sure of its exact original purpose, but it hasn't seemed to affect the image quality all that much, and it was just introducing more dust and things into the lens. So we can see that there's this second set of optics on this lens as part of the front optic in front of the diaphragm here. And at this stage, if you want, you can actually remove these to get access to the diaphragm. So right here, there's these two little divots up here. Those are the ones that are holding in the front optic itself. And then there's two little divots on the side. And those are the ones that are holding in the entire optical group. You want to go on to the ones that are in the side here to remove the entire optical group so we can get access to the front of the diaphragm. So I'll go in here. Okay, and now I can just remove this entire group, right like that. And that's the last of the optical groups. Again, we'll just take a quick look right at this. And you can see that, again, you have these two little divots up here for pointed tip spanning wrench, so you can actually undo the front optic right here to clean inside of that. Similarly, on the back section, you have another little set of divots right there to undo that optic. And you can also pretty easily just grab this back optic to unscrew it as well in most cases. So that really allows you to clean inside there. I think there are 3 or 4 layers in this piece, 3 or 4 layers in this piece, and then another 3 or 4 in that back optic as well that you can all clean inside with its 11 elements or whatever it has total. All right, so now we have access to both sides of the diaphragm here. And you can see the lens is just a shell at this point, and all the optics have been removed. So you can try to clean it in its current state, but that might be a little bit challenging because you really have to be reaching pretty far down inside the lens. So it's usually a good idea to actually remove the diaphragm fully if you're going to be cleaning it. So that's what we'll start doing now at this stage. So looking here at the back of the lens, it's going from the back to remove the diaphragm at this stage. So the first thing we're going to remove, we have the mounting ring going around here, and then there's this silver ring going around the edge of the mounting plate. So this one on the side right here. And it has just 3 little set screws going around here that you can use a slotted screwdriver on. Just loosen them up a little bit. You don't need to remove the screws fully. Okay, so I'll remove that back piece right there. So this has exposed the back of the aperture control ring going around here. And at this stage, we're actually going to remove this entire back mechanism, so everything from the focusing ring on down. And to do that, I'm going to turn the aperture control ring so the aperture is fully open. And you'll see that there are these 4 little gaps going around here. And now there are these 4 little screws down there that have been revealed. So I'm just going to loosen up those 4 screws, and we'll be able to lift off the entire back mechanism to get access to the aperture better on its own. So this will remove the mounting plate and the aperture control ring itself. Okay, and now I'll lift off this back piece. So that's separated out the back mounting plate here, which has all the mechanical controls or coupling from the aperture control ring and the stop down lever to the actual aperture from the rest of the lens here. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a later part and also remove the aperture control ring later. But let's continue on with getting the aperture here and the whole diaphragm assembly removed. So looking at the back of the lens, we now have a set of 8 screws in the center section here. And we want to go to the center set of screws here, the center 4 here, and that's what are holding in the diaphragm mechanism going around here. So once we remove these 4 screws, we'll be able to just move the diaphragm out of place. You also might want to mark where the diaphragm is currently before removing these, because it should probably line up with about where it is now. So I'll just make a little indicator of where the lever is, which is over here, and then kind of where a screw is as well, just to line those up a little bit better during the reassembly. So now I'll just remove these 4 screws, and they have little washers under them as well. All right, so now just take the entire diaphragm assembly there and get it on its own. One nice thing about these older Minolta lenses, especially the MC versions of the lenses before they went to the MD style lenses, is that usually you can get the diaphragm pretty much on its own. So it's very easy to clean in this current state. I'm not actually going to take apart the diaphragm and clean it off. It's very similar to all the other Minolta lenses though. You just have the upper plate here, which is what you see. It's kind of a bluish color. And then you have the actual diaphragm blades, and they have 2 posts on them. 1 post in the upper plate so one post is in this little track on the upper plate, and then a second post is in a little plate below, and that's the plate that actually rotates back and forth when you hit the lever over here. So to actually take this apart, the way you would do that is by looking around the diaphragm mechanism right here. There are 3 little set screws going around. Those 3 screws are holding in the upper plate. Once you remove those 3 screws, you can then remove or take out the diaphragm blades as they are currently. You might also want to make a little mark or something on the diaphragm blades, or just to score them very lightly, because once you actually remove that upper plate, the blades will just fall out of place. You can then clean them very well on their own and just put everything back together the same way. The actual interlocking of the blades is pretty much the same as on all the other Minolta lenses. It's a little bit smaller than some of the lenses, but it's not too small, so it's a pretty easy diaphragm to work with in this case. So I'll set this aside. And let's take a look now at that mounting plate again and actually remove one last piece in here. We're going to remove the aperture control ring. One reason you might want to do that is this allows you to make some adjustments to how the aperture is controlled. And it also allows you to then clean the aperture control ring on its own, because it has these grooves here. Those tend to build up a lot of grime and other stuff, so that's one reason why you might want to remove the aperture control ring. For most disassemblies though, this is completely optional. So one quick thing we want to do for the aperture control ring is actually remove the little ball bearing first that provides that clicking sound as it rotates back and forth. So there's a little ball bearing over here under this big black screw that is providing that sound. And let's just get that out of the way first, because the ball bearing is very easy to lose if you're not careful. So get the ball bearing there. So there's the ball bearing, and then I'll set those 2 aside, and it's just easy to lose, so it's best to take it out early if you can. So next up, to actually remove the aperture control ring itself, it just fits in place. It slides onto the top of this mounting plate mechanism, but what's holding it in place currently, while you can't lift it off, is this little plate over here. So this is the aperture control curve, and the curve is going in right over here. I'll talk about how all this is working more on the reassembly, but for right now we just want to remove this curve so that we can actually lift out the aperture control ring. So to do that, just loosen up these 2 screws right here. And you can remove them fully too if you want, but I'll just leave them in place in this case. And then kind of just work this back and forth to actually remove the curve here. So there's the aperture control curve. And then you can just lift off the ring right like that. And now it can be cleaned on its own as well. There's one more part in the back that you could remove. It's this little black section going around here. So this little black protector piece that kind of keeps, that's where the back optic normally goes through. And this black ring going around just keeps debris and other things out from the inside of the lens. It's completely optional to remove. I don't really see a good reason for removing it in most cases. It makes the assembly a slight bit easier when you're actually putting it back together, because you can see a bit more. So I'm just going to remove it right now. So that you can see during the reassembly things a little bit better. But this is not something I'd usually recommend, and you can put the lens back together just fine without doing this step. All right, so there's that little ring as well. Again, completely optional to remove that. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to actually find out how to remove the inner part of this focusing mechanism from the focusing ring and the rest of the lens body here. I ran into a similar sort of problem with the 21mm NL Rokkor, but on that one at least I was able to remove some of the front section of the lens, and on this lens I just wasn't able to figure out how to do that, or how to remove any of these sections any further really. You can of course remove this back plate here, this silver section on the inside, just by removing the 4 screws in here. You can also remove the 2 little tracks that are actually what control the focusing, so that the inner section moves up and down instead of just spinning about. Each of those has 3 little screws, and then you can lift out the metal pieces that are guiding along the tracks in there. And then there are these other 3 screws going around here on the black focusing ring itself. There. But even after undoing all those, I wasn't able to find out how to remove this intersection from the outer section, which is unfortunate because it's going to be a lot more difficult to actually clean the lens like this in its current state, because you have the focusing mechanism right next to the body section. So if you are going to clean it in this state, just be careful and make sure that you don't actually get any water or cleaning solution inside the focusing mechanism and end up damaging it. And if anybody does know how to actually separate these two sections, I'd really be interested in seeing that. But unfortunately, that's as far as I was able to take the lens apart for this disassembly. All right, so that actually has the disassembly, as far as I'm going to take it today, complete. So I have some of the optical pieces, the three big optical groups in here. So the back optic, the middle section of the optic, and the front optic. And before I showed how all these can be further disassembled into the various optical groups that the lens has to access inside of all the elements, this particular lens is very good for doing that. You can really take apart the optics very well. And the optics themselves, even on this back optic, they're easy enough to work with. It is small, but they're easy enough to work with. That you can really just take them apart and clean inside them very well. I'd only recommend doing that, of course, if there's actually something you need to fix in there. If there's just a little tiny mote of dust or something in the lens that you don't like the look of, don't take apart the optics because you'll probably get more dust in there or fingerprints or something. It's very hard to avoid doing that, so it's better to just leave little problems alone. But if there's fungus in there, you can really take apart this lens very well. We also have things like the mounting plate and some of the controls in here, in the back section. Then the big focusing piece here that I wasn't able to take any further apart. And then the diaphragm, which I also explained how to take apart further. And you can also check out the NL 21mm video in which I do take apart the diaphragm. I think it's pretty much the exact same diaphragm component on that lens as well. All right, so let's get started on the reassembly here. So to start off with the reassembly, first off, let's get this diaphragm piece back into the lens. So before, we kind of marked off two little pieces where the little post of the back of the diaphragm control lever needed to go. So over here, we kind of marked those off, and I'll just line these up on the back section and slide the diaphragm piece back in place. All right, so I got that lined up now, and I'll reinstall the four little screws going around the top section here, and each of those little screws has a tiny washer as well. It's important to note that on the back section here, just real quick, on the back section there are all these different screws going around, the four here and then the six on the two rings over here, and then these other screws on the inside here. They all look about the same, but they all are different types of screws. So if you do take them apart, make sure to mark or cleanly separate out which ones are which, because during the disassembly, things will kind of fit together, but you'll end up damaging the lens if you're not careful. And these ones in particular, the ones that are going into the diaphragm right now, into these four spots, have little washers. So that's one easy way to identify them. But it's pretty easy to mix up the other screws in here, the ones on the track system and the one on the back section here. So just be careful with that. And it's worth noting as well that this is one area where you can actually adjust how the diaphragm or the aperture opens and closes here. Just by spinning around this section, if you loosen up the four screws in here slightly, spinning around this intersection of the diaphragm and then tightening it back down, you can control how far the diaphragm opens and closes. This particular adjustment is good for controlling the very minimum of the diaphragm, which you can see by just moving the little lever over here, and how large it opens at the maximum as well. But there are other places where we can adjust it later, and I'll talk about those in a little while. So next up, let's set aside this piece for a moment and take a look back at this mounting plate and the aperture control ring. So the aperture control ring right here is just going to slide into place. It has one side over here with the numbers. There's a little thing sticking down from there. That's the side that's going to go up, and then it'll just slide into place on top of the mounting plate. And there also is a little screw over here right near the 21mm indicator. That is what is limiting how far the aperture control ring can turn in either direction. You want to find the little cutout in here on the aperture control ring itself, right like that. That's going to go over the screw so that the screw hits up against either extreme of there and does not turn, so that you have the little indicator lined up with the numbers as well. So that looks good, but we have to get so there's nothing locking the aperture control ring in place at this stage, but now we have to get the little aperture control curve back in place. So the way that this is all going to work, if I bring over this piece right here and show how things are getting coupled together a little bit more. So on the actual diaphragm mechanism, you have this little post back here that's controlling the diaphragm. directly, and there's no spring or anything in there. All the mechanical parts that are coupling the aperture control ring and coupling the stop-down lever on the back here to the diaphragm are in this back section of the lens. That's also where the little spring is that's holding it open by default. So if you look over here, there's these wires and other things. Those are what are holding open they're acting as a spring and holding open the aperture by default. So there are the two ways that you can control the lens. One is just by hitting the stop-down lever over here, and that is going to directly move this big metal piece on the inside here. So you'll notice that this piece has a little pocket right here on it. That's going to go over the aperture control post back here so that those two are locked together. So when you hit the stop-down lever, it's going to move that little pocket and it's going to move that post there. So that's one way it's going to be controlled. The other, of course, is by turning the aperture control ring. And if you notice over on this section right here of this back section, there's another little post. That post is actually going to sit in front of the aperture control curve right here. So the aperture control curve would kind of be on this side right here in this orientation. So as you rotate around the aperture control ring back here, the aperture control curve is going to be attached to the aperture control ring, and it's going to be sitting behind this post. So as the post goes up and down along that curve, as the curve moves back and forth, it's going to open and close the aperture. So it'll basically move up and down along that curve, tracking the curve and opening and closing the diaphragm, like that. So those are the two ways that things are being coupled together. So we have to get this little curve back in place as the next step of the reassembly here. So it's going to go, as I showed before, with the more sticking up part over towards the pocket here. And you need to thread it back in so that it goes on top or into the little pocket with the two screws previously. And if you remove these screws, you just have to get into the pocket in general. So it's going to go behind. Let me make sure I got the right side here. Going to go behind the aperture control curve, or behind that post, and then line up with, go through the slot back here. It's a little hard to see, but there's a slot that goes through to the aperture control. Oops, I think I actually have it reversed. The little post should be on the other side instead. So this is the proper way it should go, with the sticking up part over here, furthest away from the pocket. I got those reversed for a second. So let me get this in place now, and that's looking much better. So you can see that now I have the aperture control curve going from the inside of the lens back behind this post, going into the outside of the lens with the two screws right here. So I'll just tighten down these screws for right now, just so that the curve does not fall out of place. But this is another place where we can actually readjust the aperture later, and I'll demonstrate that a little bit later on in the reassembly. So one last part of the whole reassembly here. For this back component, we have to get the little ball bearing, there it goes, it's very easy to lose, ball bearing back in place. So the ball bearing, we have the screw that was holding in the ball bearing, and both of those were just going into the little position over here. So I'll put the little tiny ball bearing right here onto the end of the screw thing. It doesn't really have to be perfect, it will kind of guide itself into the right spot, and then just stick both of those into the back section of the lens, right like that, and just lock down the big screw as well. Okay, and now when you actually turn the aperture control ring, you should get that nice clicking sound. Alright, so that has this little back section and the mounting plate all complete now. And let's actually now go and reattach these two sections together. So as I showed before, you have the little post on the aperture back here that's going to go into the pocket on this piece of the mounting plate. So just line those two up, get those in alignment, make sure that the entire section here is flush against the lens. There are a few other orientations where this might not be completely flush. It might be kind of sitting up at an angle, almost like this, where you can see the silver section still. You need to make sure it's flush and that it that is fully coupled back into the lens at this stage. Now I'm going to turn the aperture control section here, the aperture control ring, over. Let me actually take that off for a second until I can see the little screw holes through the gaps in here as well. So I'm going to get those gaps to be visible. And now I just have to line up the 4 little screw holes here with the 4 little screw holes going on the bottom down here. And once those are all lined up, so I can kind of just eyeball it from the back section here, then I can just reattach those pieces with the 4 screws going down into the little pockets there to couple these two together. All right, and you want to make sure that the lens is fully focusing between its two extremes here, so the 0.25 and then infinity at this stage. So that's one thing you want to check. And you might notice at this stage, if you turn the aperture control ring, that it's not really doing the proper thing. So what is most likely going wrong in this case is that the aperture control curve, although it's been reinstalled, is not actually aligned properly. And on this particular lens, the aperture control curve is rather finicky, so it really takes some fine adjustment to actually be able to align it and get it working properly. So it seems like as I turn the lens here, you'll notice that it takes until about f5.6 here until it actually starts making any adjustments. So that's something we're going to want to fix, and the way to do that is by adjusting the aperture control curve. So I'll just loosen up these two screws over here slightly, and I'm going to push on the back of the aperture control curve here just a little bit with another screwdriver here. So what I'm trying to do is just edge it a little bit closer to where it actually starts engaging. Here I'm at, let me make sure I'm at 2.8 or at 16 here. Just push the side of the aperture control curve a little bit forward until it starts engaging with the lens there, with the aperture. So I can see it's right about there. And then I'll tighten this down, and I might have to adjust the other side in a moment. But now when I go and adjust the lens, a little better. Looks like this, when it's fully open though, there's still a bit of a problem. It's not actually entirely invisible. There's just the little edges of the aperture and the diaphragm going around there. So I need to adjust this other side a little bit as well. So I'll just loosen up this a little tiny bit. And this is just a trial and error process. If things are really, really off, then you need to go back to this intersection here and actually spin the aperture and hold diaphragm piece around. But in most cases, you can actually just adjust the, here I'll get this fully open, adjust the aperture control curve to control that. So I'm just going to now take the aperture control curve until it's just off the edge right here. It's looking a little better now. And what you want to have is make sure that none of the edges of the blades are visible when it's fully open. It should just be a circle going around there. And then also make sure that at every piece or every stop of the aperture blades are moving some. And another thing that you could have done that I mentioned during the disassembly originally is you can also score the aperture blades when you're initially taking apart the lens if you believe that the original aperture setting is correct and you want to try to match that. You can also take photos and try to match it up, but it's kind of an imprecise thing in general unless you do have some sort of marking. And on a small aperture like this, it's still generally kind of imprecise. And it doesn't really need to be absolutely perfect. In most cases, you're just looking for making sure that each stop has a bit of movement and that the aperture settings are generally in the right range. So I'm pretty happy with where this is currently. It's looking pretty correct. All right, so continuing along with the reassembly now, let's just continue along putting together the back section here. Now I'm going to take the back glass element here, just reinstall that. It just screws in place into the back of the little diaphragm piece right there. And it has the two little divots on the exterior there for the spanning wrench that you can use to lock that piece down a little bit better. All right, so it looks good. And then we have the little black protector plate here on the back section. It has 3 screw holes going around here, here, and here, and then a little cutout over on this side as well. The cutout goes over the post, the stop-down lever on the back of the lens here. So just install that. And then just to complete the back reassembly here, have the silver ring that goes around the back section here. The orientation of this one doesn't matter at all. Just slide it in place and then loosely press it up against the back of the aperture control ring there and tighten down the 3 screws going around on the exterior of the silver ring. Okay, so that's got the entire back of the lens now reassembled. Put on a cap here to give a better surface to work with. Now we just have to get in the front elements here, get those back into the lens. So the first one is the smaller of the two, just this little barrel-shaped piece of set of optics right here. It just screws in place as well. It's a little harder to install just because it's a little further down inside the lens. Okay, so that's looking good. And then I'll use the two outermost divots here and one here. Use a spanning wrench on those two to just reinstall that fully, lock it down. Now I have the big front optic right here. It is also just going to screw in place into the front of the lens. Okay, and there's nothing or no easy way to actually really lock this down well. You might want to be able to find some sort of pipe that has a diameter so that it's just large enough to press on the exterior ring going around here and not on the glass. And that does allow you to lock it down a little bit better. You can also just try tightening it down just by applying pressure to the edges here, and usually that'll be fine too. Just be aware that it may come a little bit loose at some point, and you might have to tighten it back down. Not a huge deal, it's harder to tighten this kind of lens back down when you don't have anything to grip onto, and if you can't remove this exterior black section going around there. And to finish off the reassembly here, just reinstall the name ring. It also just screws in place. And then you can use the two little divots on the exterior of the name ring to fully lock that one down as well. And that has the reassembly complete. You want to make sure that the lens properly focuses, of course, between infinity and the minimum focusing distance, and kind of has a clicking sound at each end. Want to make sure that the diaphragm is operating properly with the aperture control ring and the stop down lever on the back. And that just everything is working properly. Overall, this lens is very similar in its construction to the NL lens here. The optical layout and everything is almost identical. Really, the main differences are around the body section and how the optics and things are going into the body section. They're similar, but there are some differences. I wasn't able to find out how to take this one fully apart and remove all the body sections, but I do think you can still clean and maintain the lens pretty well in the state that I was able to disassemble it in. This is actually one of my favorite lenses to actually shoot with as well, and it's nice that this lens is very repairable. I noticed that it was starting to get a little bit of oil on one of the optics in here that actually was affecting image quality. And because this lens is so repairable, I was able to actually take apart all the optics and clean inside of this lens. So it's definitely a really nice lens to own. It's probably my go-to lens for shooting at sunsets or daybreaks when you have the really nice golden hour or blue hour light. And it just produces really nice images, and I just like the way it controls as well. So I definitely recommend this lens. Can't recommend it highly enough. There's nothing really special about it when you look at the types of images it produces, but I really like the overall result. It's not the sharpest lens, it's not the smallest lens or anything like that, but I find that it's just a joy to shoot with and produces some great images.